Wednesday to everybody. It is the 24th of August, about 6:30 on the East Coast time here in the United States. We've got a Skype scheduled for 7 o'clock tonight. I'm hoping that everything holds out. We're in the middle of a rather nice thunderstorm, which is common here in South Florida. But the power is flickered on and off up here. And of course, if I lose power and things like that, Skype's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But I hope to see folks from 7 to 8 tonight if it's possible. If not, no worries. A couple of general announcements, and then we'll move into some of the topics that you talked about in this past week. One is in terms of timing. I know that many folks are starting school right now. Either class starts next week, or it's just started this week, or something along those lines. And I know that that's I think creating some of the sort of quietness that's occurred in Module 1. So I understand and appreciate that. At the same point in time, this is a seminar that really is fixed in terms of its timetable and the ways in which we're all to interact as a group. I think is the best way to say it. You really should be not simply just posting and completing the assignment criteria that way, but also responding to your colleagues. And so, in my evaluation and approaches, I'll try to nudge in the right directions. But at the end of the day, if you're not able to complete the completion criteria as outlined in the workshop, then it's not a matter of just you paying for the course and you get the certification and things like that. So please review the completion criteria and make sure that you're meeting the spirit as well as the letter to it. And if you've got any questions or concerns, by all means, email me. Again, I can be a little bit flexible, but we are, since it's Wednesday, we're moving on to Module 2 today. And so, if you're tracing things on Module 1, you've got that catch up to do, plus get into Module 2, starting really today. So let's get started. I think the most interesting discussions, really popped up in the ideas for teaching to learning. But I want to sort of go through, the module straightforward. Everyone, it appears, gets the idea and the ways in which global politics is located within the mission of the IB. In fact, the commentary was, and I'm just looking at notes here that I made from earlier in the weekend. The commentary that it's surprising that this course hadn't been adopted earlier, or something to the effect of that this falls right in line with the mission. I'm glad you picked up on those points. I too think that the course should have been adopted earlier, and of course it was in some sense. I mean, the course is spent some years in pilot, 4 in fact. So you're looking at really just now the first this year's senior class. So if you're teaching traditional high school in the United States, this year's senior class is the first group of students who have had access to this course outside of the pilot. Those of you just starting to teach it this fall, you'll have the second wave of pilot, and in 4 more years we'll go back and revisit the curriculum again. Although that process is going to start a little earlier than 4 years. But the life cycle of this course from conception to pilot actually takes about 6-7 years, and the review process is almost ongoing. I may have mentioned this previously, but the new curriculum coordinator, who's going to cover both history and politics, is Oscar Van Nooyen. He was one of the original he was one of my original collaborators, or I collaborated with him. We were amongst the first 12 teachers of this course, and so he's taken over the curriculum direction of the course, and so we've got somebody very, very exceptional at the helm here, and so he'll be leading the sort of the maintenance and then the eventual revision of the course in a few years. But in terms of the time frame, the last 4 years in pilot and 2 years prior to that, we spent working on developing this, and this comes from a couple of different areas. It's not just inside sort of the ivory tower that is in the Hague, which, if you've been to the IB building there, it's nestled right between Europol, the Novotel World Forum, where they held the nuclear summit a few years ago, and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So we'd go and watch the war crimes trials when we were there on lunch break. It's not just, this course was not just created in that context. Rather, it really came from a wide range of experts and practitioners, inside and outside of of academia in the teaching field, as well as the school-based syllabus, the SBSs, in human rights, in politics, some of which came out of Middle East and North Africa, but also really around the world. A lot of schools tried different things out, and so that was this process was rather long going in this respect. But to that end, because this development's been, say, the last 6 years or so, it really has been involved with the alignment of the mission of the IB as the organization engaged in rebranding and articulating its mission, then carrying that out into practice. The conference theme from 2 summers ago, IB for all, which is a mainstay of the IB at this point in time, is reflected, I think, in both the language of the syllabus that you picked up on, as well as the practice. When I taught the course, it was a situation where anyone who was interested in the course could get in. It wasn't just reserved for IB candidates, at least in its final year. Once we cleared through a pilot, we had to do it, I think, with IB candidates only during the pilot for some accreditation reasons in the state of Florida, something haphazard. But it wasn't reserved for kids who had the highest GPAs or came from AP classes and things like that. And I think that more and more schools are adopting this heterogeneous approach to accepting students into the program. And this is one of those courses that I've always found been one of the most successful. I taught students who were English language learners right off the plane from Shanghai to kids who grew up in the United States and had every benefit possible, to students with mild forms of learning differences, dyslexia, autism spectrum, things like that, and all of them were successful to a range of degrees because of I think the accessibility of the course and the concepts and the mission of the course itself to furthering global understanding and difference around the world. So I think that you caught on to those points in a very, very nuanced fashion. Nothing, all of this is things that I've seen before, which is a good thing in that respect, in that you're grasping the nuances there. In terms of approaches to teaching and learning, and some of that ties in, to what I was talking about earlier with the accessibility model. The idea of inquiry-based approaches, of conceptual understanding of the ways in which you can take the course and make it your own. It's very, very different than a traditionally prescribed social science course, or even if you've taught in the IB previously, especially if you've taught history. And I'm not trying to dump on history folks at all. But if you're familiar with that approach and that syllabus, or the advanced placement syllabus or syllabi in the United States, those approaches are very prescriptive in terms of content and what is to be covered. And with global politics, it's rather different. It's big ideas, it's concepts, and it's skills. Particularly the idea of inquiry to acquire knowledge and understanding, to apply that knowledge and understanding through the process of inquiry, to synthesize these findings and different perspectives through the process of discovery, and then communicate and report that out through written demonstration and through oral demonstration and performance. And so your discussions in this way, I think, were in the ideas for ATL were informed, or better representative of some of the things we want to look at in terms of applying approaching to teaching and learning. I don't know to what extent you all have gone through ATL training, and I would ask and you to sort of to push back, I think, or at least encourage, maybe that's the better way to say it, your coordinators and whoever else runs professional development, and not just get access to material, but actually workshop and develop some training on ATL within your school communities, within your sites. It's not enough just to read the brochures and things like that. It really is a matter of practice and reflection and observation of others. That really is what brings ATL to life in your school settings. And so I encourage you to make that really a underlying piece of your professional development pedagogy in the year to come, as you roll out this course. In terms of particular educational practices and pedagogies. Again, the course itself isn't doesn't take an exclusive approach to pedagogy, so long as it's rooted in these basic constructivist principles, which are, again, this idea of discovery and inquiry, and discussion. And so there really isn't one way to take the approach. I would offer, though, that some of the best courses I've seen and the best sets of teaching practices I've seen combine the conventional with the progressive. I think that there are certain attributes of what we would call classical education that can work in this course, particularly the idea of discussion and student-led discussion, the workshop, the seminar. Produce some very, very good and engaging results when you put students front and center. At the other end of the spectrum, or as the circle sort of comes around, the student-led approach to inquiry, the use of student-led research, the use of simulations, anything that's Montessori influenced. Obviously, Montessori isn't applicable at this level, but that sort of work also puts the student front and center and inquiry front and center. And so those are ways that you want to think about not only constructing classroom environments, but also in the ways in which you assess student work. A tremendous amount of work on feedback and formative assessment, as opposed to a series of cascading summative assessments. Some of those that sort of work tends to sort of fall into that middle range between classical and progressive, and doesn't necessarily have the same sort of benefits writ large, but maybe in this course in particular, because the concepts and coursework can be so challenging. So your ideas that you put forth in the learning engagement number 2 on ATL reflect a lot of these ideas. But I would stress it from my own experience, as well as what I've observed in other schools in Asia and in Europe, as well as the United States, that spending a tremendous amount of time on giving students personalized feedback and formative assessment, practicing essay questions, practicing paper 1s and paper 2s, and giving students the opportunity to revise and resubmit that work, has a long-term, durable impact on their learning. As you move over the arc of this course in 2 years. But those are my sort of comments on engagement 2. The other engagement 2, level perspectives in space. This is a tricky one and a sort of an odd one for me, just semantically. Levels of analysis, as outlined in the syllabus, on the one hand is an analytical tool that helps you, and obviously the students, organize political events, phenomena, concepts, and things along those lines. So I don't need to reread the syllabus, but going from the global down to the local, and we'll talk about community in just a second. But that helps, on the one hand, scaffold sort of geographic space. At the same point in time, if you have a background in international relations, this is not Ken Waltz's levels of analysis. I was always bothered by the term that we use, levels of analysis, in global politics, because in IR that has a very, very specific construct: the individual, the state society complex, and then the international system. And we just use it in Glopo. It's important that you just differentiate between what Waltz suggests in Man, the State, and War, and then eventually this sort of arc of realist and neo-realist theoretical perspectives and traditional liberal IR theory, and then some more contemporary theories, not excluding those two schools of thought, but others in general sort of have opened up this idea of levels of analysis. Anyway, we use levels of analysis as our term, not as or our concept, our framework, not as Waltz's. And so on the one hand, it helps students and you all organize some space, but don't think of these things as necessarily super stringent lines. The idea, the national level is a contested term in and of itself. We often use the concept of nation, a defined group of people that share common historical, territorial, linguistic, and cultural values. We often conflate that for the state, which is, of course, is not the case. State, defined territory, permanent population, government, capacity for external relations, sovereignty, things along those lines. So we even do, this isn't the sharpest of tools in some sense, and so approach the levels of analysis with that understanding that some of these lines are fuzzy. When public health is a great example. When is it a global and when is it an international issue? Globally, health can be understood as a generalized concern about infectious diseases around the world, and internationally, we can think about diseases that are transmitted by a vector of, say, mosquitoes, and so then that includes the universe of malaria to Zika, frankly, and then obviously when we start looking at regions, we look at the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean, and then folks, those of us here in South Florida, have it as well, and you sort of move down the ladder that way. So it does have some analytical value, but recognize that it's got a little bit of fuzziness there as well. The community aspect, I think, is the description in the guide is a good one in the sense that we shouldn't think of community as something beyond local, like sublocal. Rather, we think about it we think about communities as crossing or transcending these rather fuzzy borders. So you can have a community of NGO activists, NGO workers, community of aid workers, particularly if you're looking at the politics of aid and development in conflict zones, whether it's the recent attacks, back in July on aid workers in South Sudan, or some emerging research coming out of American political scientists that find that U.S. support, particularly sent through, or it's U.S. support through either USAID or to NGOs on the ground, actually can increase the intensity of conflict, because rebel groups and other belligerents in conflict zones tend to recognize where the Americans are sending money, and so that's because the Americans are prioritizing a particular either group of people or territorial space things or issue, and then they know that the resource being directed there, so that's important, and so therefore the fighting tends to shift that way. Anyway, this idea of community is that it's going to transcend these particular borders, and oftentimes, between local and national, or national and regional boundaries. So think of it as tools, frameworks, but not something so rigid. The same thing comes, with this idea of perspectives as well. I think the guide does a good job, and your commentary, there's some good ideas here as well when we think about either refugees or human rights, or as sort of as examples, or the idea of looking at the broader categories of gender or ethnicity or religion, in that these are operational definitions that help us understand examples and particulars, but they're not, as with any concept in social science, it's not, well, natural science, to be fair, as well. And this is where those of you who have taught TOK or have a background in epistemology can start weighing in as well. These terms shouldn't be used so rigidly and so hard and fast. So the exercise I used to do with students was to develop conceptual definitions, and you all allude to this as well. Develop conceptual definitions of some of these terms, and then make regular reference to them as they work through the specific real-world examples. As we think about sovereignty, contested term in its own right, going back to Krasner's discussion on sovereignty as organized hypocrisy, but constructing environments where students can inquire and develop their own definitions of, say, sovereignty. What does sovereignty look like at different levels of analysis or through different particular lenses? Sovereignty through the lens of ethnicity may look very different to Europeans than it does to indigenous populations. And then knowing the context and the contextuality of that term helps students understand the real world cases. So constructing and developing exercises and lessons and experiences along those lines, I think, are critically helpful to get to the nuance and to the complexity. It isn't just about memorizing a definition, memorizing a particular worldview, and then going and making the world fit into that. That's not how the course is designed, nor really how IR works. The last thing I have, and there's good work here again, on the conceptual definitions that are put into place. Again, it sort of leads into the what I was suggesting earlier, in that there's always ways to define these concepts. There's always examples of how you can link them to to examples in the world, but understanding the nuance and the, to use the IB phraseology, the counterclaims or the alternative perspectives on these topics is always good. And so, again, asking students to look at, Harpinder, you looked at sovereignty, Jenna, you looked at human rights here. Developing these definitions are good and examples of, but also looking at the limits of these definitions are helpful, because getting students to understand those nuances is crucial when you start looking at particular cases. Any of you teaching South Sudan, this year or next year is going to look at, you're going to look at that and go and be very puzzled by how we're going to encapsulate all 16 concepts, which we can, by the way, in looking at the South Sudanese conflict. But looking at the limits of the definitions that we've developed, but also, and while also simultaneously recognizing the strengths of what human rights are, how we can define them, how they can be applied through certain lenses, and then also the limits of that notion of human rights, whether they are in fact universal. Just to pick up a hypothetical example in this sort of thing. So in any event, that's sort of my general discussion and trying to tie in what you all wrote in terms of the in terms of your responses to the first round of engagements. I don't think there's any. I'm just actually going to log in 1 second. I just want to make sure I didn't miss a burning question. I know Harpinder asked me something earlier, and I punted and said we'll get to it eventually. Okay, nobody else put it there. There's options for sharing resources and things like that. We'll move through that over the next couple of weeks, but always keep an eye out for there. Post anything, frankly. For those of you starting school in the coming weeks, post anything that you'd want to include, try out, get feedback on, so we can, and we can talk about that, and that can be certainly the option for a Skype discussion as well. So feel free to we can work outside the space of the Moodle platform, the workshop and things along those lines. So I've got a couple minutes before Skype starts. If you're there, so I'm trying to wrap up. Let's think. So the next module is the externally assessed pieces. This may seem boring, but it's worthwhile for you to go through for a number of reasons. First, you get a handle on how your students are going to be assessed, regardless of whether they're at standard level or at higher level. If you've taught an IB before, this is really straightforward and really really easy. This will look like other Group 3 subjects. Or if you've taught at A levels, or if you've taught in any sort of any sort of Cambridge program, or even advanced placement, some of this will look familiar to a variety of perspectives. So that's the nice thing, and that's where sometimes I get the commentary, oh, well, this is easy, this is boring. Not so much, because actually I think that the paper 1 and 2 and the exercises you're going to look at are particularly challenging, in the sense that it really does take an understanding of how the student will be assessed, and linking the assessment objectives outlined in those first couple pages of the guide to the assessment in particular. So pay special attention to those ideas as you work through the assessments. In terms of the group exercises, I normally just leave this to the group to figure things out, although there's only 4 of you. I would suggest that you work in either by yourself or in pairs, and do as much of this as you can. This isn't a matter of, oh, I'll just do the one and contribute to the group. This is you've got a great opportunity here to practice playing with as many of the example papers and resources that you've got. By the way, those of course are all in the resources page on the. If you go to the workshop homepage, you can see resources and find all the papers and things like that. So I would suggest that you do as many of these as possible. In fact, the more that the more practice you do in assessing the work and aligning it to what the mark scheme suggests, as well as the examiner comments, the better off you're going to be in understanding how the student's work will be assessed. And it sets some ideas up for you as how you want to run the course or run assessment. Again, more formative than summative, but run assessment in these courses or in the courses you move forward. So rather than say, oh, Jenna does this, or Harpinder does this, or James does this, or Eric does this, do as many of these as you can. There's nothing wrong with having a couple people have that, sample A, sample B, things like that. So do those as much as you can, and then post your questions, ideas, commentary, to the engagements, as you can, and make sure that you're spending time reading each other's comments and providing feedback and things like that. It's always difficult when everyone comments on source A and says, oh yeah, I agree with the examiner. Well, defend that. Why do you agree with the examiner? Or why was the examiner off? Or ask questions, how is it difficult? How did you find it to assess question 4 in paper 1, which I'm forecasting a little bit. That's going to be a tricky one, just in terms of the way the mark scheme is constructed. So play with this as much as you can over the next week or so. And then I'll be available on Skype and email and check in regularly when I can over the week. So have a fantastic week. If you're in the southeast, try to avoid the tropical wave that's coming in the next 5 days. And I'll speak to you pretty soon. Cheers.